Indeed, O God, hear our prayer, cry of our heart, to know you and to live as your people in this world. And all God's people said, Amen. You may be seated. A few months ago, I have a news app on my phone that aggregates all the news sources that I use. And a few months ago, as I opened up my app, for some reason, my news aggregate thought that I wanted to read the story. The headline reading, "After 17 days and 1,000 miles, a mother orca's tour of grief is finally over." I was actually piqued in curiosity, so my news aggregate was right. And I clicked, and I read. The story, in part, read, "The orca mother who carried her deceased baby for 17 days and 1,000 miles is finally returning to normal." The grieving mother's journey generated a national response, connecting with many who've experienced grief. But those who were concerned about her refusal to let go can be assured that she looks healthy and appears to be moving on. She was seen Saturday off the Washington coast with fellow members of her pod chasing a school of salmon. Her behavior could be described as remarkably frisky. At the time, I was reading a little bit about the process of grief and mourning and sorrow, the way grief shows up in humans and other creatures even. And I was struck by the way this news article seemed to try to resolve grief, even slap happiness on top of it. It seemed as if the writer wanted to wrap up the experience of grief, even in an animal, into a neatly tied bow with phrases like, "finally returning to normal," "appears to be moving on," or "her behavior could be described as remarkably frisky." I mean, how does one actually tell if a killer whale is remarkably frisky while trying to catch salmon to eat? BBC journalist and editor Finlo Rohr has a name for this. He's coined the term happy endification. It's a long one. And he coined it in an article that he wrote entitled, "Why the Obsession with Happy Endings?" Happy endification, he says, has found its way into all sorts of places. Beyond news articles like that one I read about the whale, Rohr noted the modern trend in book-to-movie adaptations that has screenwriters turning a book's uncertain ending with ominous undertones into a movie with a clearly defined positive resolution, replacing the book's morose ending with something more akin to "and they lived happily ever after." And then he notes television production companies have increasingly higher expectations for new sitcoms, axing those that don't produce ratings and laughs within the first few episodes. There's also a nonfiction genre called misery lit. It hit high demand decades ago, but has in the last few decades taken a drive in sales. And then editor-in-chief of the bookseller Philip Stone notes that these days, even authors who write biographies, autobiographies, and memoirs, no matter how tragic their story, are being encouraged by their editors to end their stories with more positive conclusions. Happy endification. Prolific author and Harvard professor Jamaica Kincaid, whose work has been the recipient of many literary awards and also highly critical reviews, has a hypothesis for our bent toward happy endification. She says, "I think, in many ways, the problem that my writing has with the American reviewer is that Americans find difficulty, failure, pain, suffering very hard to take. They are inevitably looking for a happy ending, and I will not just give the happy ending. Life is difficult, and that's that. I am not at all, absolutely not at all, interested in the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of positivity. I am interested in the pursuit of truth, and the truth is complicated and nuanced." She continues, yet in the American dream, difficulty, failure, pain, suffering are only tolerated to the extent that they feed the success story and make it even better. The happy ending, the positive outcome. So in essence, the American dream can't really tolerate the truth of life. If Kincaid's hypothesis is true, the book of Lamentations would have had its fair share of highly critical reviews if released in 2019. You will see over the course of the next 5 weeks that this book is all about difficulty and suffering and failure and pain, and it isn't neatly resolved with a positive outcome or a happy ending by the final verse. After all, the very name of the book isn't shy about its purpose. Lamentations, lament. Although lament is often thought of as a response to death, at its most basic, lament is protest in the face of any pain or trouble or suffering or sorrow or despair. It's the language of those who mourn and grieve the way of things. Soong-Chan Rah, author of Prophetic Lament, simply defines lament as honesty before God and before one another about the reality of suffering. As we work our way through this book over the course of our Lenten season, God's people, at the heart of the story of Lamentations, we will find, we will hear, we will discover, have much protesting, mourning, and grieving to do. It begins, Lamentations 1, verses 1 through 4. How lonely sits the city that was once full of people. How like a widow she has become. She that was once great among nations, she that was a queen of the provinces, has become a vassal. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile with the suffering and hard servitude. She lives among the nations and finds no resting place. Her pursuers have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. Most likely, those aren't the most familiar verses to you. We don't hear them a lot in the church. But these 4 verses do reference a familiar storyline of invasion and exile. In fact, last summer, we spent the whole summer, some of you are having flashbacks of horror, in the Minor Prophets. Do you remember that? We spent the whole summer in the Minor Prophets, and we talked often of the story that these 4 verses remind us of. And it's the setting, this story is the setting for the book of Lament. And because I want to review that story real quick of the setting, I get a great excuse to once again display my awesome stick figure drawing skills you may remember from last summer. So God's people were finally living and thriving in the promised land, in this one large united kingdom. It was good times. But then, eventually, the land and the people did as land and people do, and they divided. They became this divided kingdom with the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Jerusalem, that divine holy city with the sacred temple, was in that southern kingdom of Judah. Now, over time, in that usual quest for empire expansion, the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Assyrians, and the people exiled out into the world. And then, about 100 or so years later, the southern kingdom of Judah was also conquered, and the city of Jerusalem overrun, and God's holy temple destroyed, and those people were exiled. And so both the people of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom were pushed out into the other empires. And the story of those exiled people is the focus of a lot of sermon fodder. We've talked about it a lot. And it's also the focus, the exiled people, of that first part of verse 3 in the opening of Lamentations that says, Judah has gone into exile with suffering and hard servitude. She lives among the nations and finds no resting place. This verse mentions the exiles scattered about, but Lamentations is not their story. No, Lamentations is the lesser-known story of those left behind in the city of Jerusalem. You see, the Babylonians were scorched earth conquerors. They burned crops and they salted fields. They filled water wells. They ransacked and demolished every structure, making streets of the city impassable, businesses improbable, and homes unlivable. And the source and the center of God's people's identity, that holy temple, was turned to rubble. And then the Babylonians left a remnant of people to live in the rubbled shadows of God's holy temple and scrounge out a meager life out of the once flourishing sacred city. The prophet Jeremiah, he was among the remnant left behind. And the intro to his letter found in Jeremiah 29 clues us in on the differences between those who were sent into exile and those left behind in the remnant. Jeremiah 29, verse 1 says, "These are the words of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the remaining elders among the exiles, to the priests, the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem into Babylon. This was after the king, the queen mother, the court officials, the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the artisans, the skilled laborers, the smiths had all departed from Jerusalem into exile." So if all the religious leaders, the king, the queen mother, all the political officials, all the artisans, all the business owners, all the skilled workers, all the laborers and their families were all scattered into exile, who was left? Historian John Bright describes it this way: "The leading citizens and the skilled laborers were either killed or deported, and the remnant left behind consisted of poor peasants, and those too weak or infirm to travel or work. Basically, all those considered incapable of making trouble, threatening the new empire, or rebuilding the city." Lamentations, then, is the story of vulnerable people living with the daily struggle of the aftermath of destruction and devastation of that once flourishing holy city. It's the other half of the exile story, a story we don't hear often, but we're going to. We're going to hear this story, this poetic expression of different voices and perspectives in the coming weeks of Lent. At some points, we'll hear in Lamentations, like this morning's introductory verses. This morning's introductory verses were from a narrator who speaks as if this narrator is the city. So the personification of the city's pain and grief. So at some points we will hear from this narrator who speaks as if the city itself. At other points in Lamentations, we hear a lone person lamenting personal grief and pain. And at still other points, it's the whole community lamenting their shared experience together. A narrator, a single voice, the community at large. And throughout all these voices, we will learn, we will be taught the purpose of Lent, the prerogative of lament, the particularity of lament, and more. And these are lessons we deeply need. Because happy identification isn't just a word that describes movies, TV shows, literature, news. We've brought it into the church, into worship with us too. The 21st century church is hot in the pursuit of happiness and the pursuit of positivity and the pursuit of prosperity. Jamaica Kincaid's words we heard earlier could easily be described using the 21st century church in its place. Yet in the church, difficulty, failure, pain, suffering are only tolerated to the extent that they feed the success story, the happy ending, the positive outcome. So in essence, the church can't really tolerate the truth about life. The signs of this are seen in a variety of our places and spaces. like in our singing. An analysis of the 100 most frequently used songs in worship as reported to CCLI, that place we legally have to report the songs we sing, revealed that over the course of the last 7 years, anywhere from 5 to fewer songs could even be loosely categorized as lament out of the top 100 songs reported on a quarterly basis. And then an analysis of the most frequently used hymnals across all denominations revealed that roughly 10% of songs in every hymnal are songs of lament, which churches self-report using very infrequently. So 5 or fewer songs out of years and years of reported songs, and roughly 10% of hymnals categorized as lament. The signs can also be found in our sermons. ShareFaith.com collected sermon titles and passages from places like church websites and YouTube and Bulletin and came up with the top 50 sermon themes. And in the mix were things like the love of God and prayer and marriage, living an abundant life, God's provision, creation, forgiveness, all good topics, but nothing on lament, suffering, struggle, difficult times, etc. in 50 mentions of sermons. And a widely used coaching network for preachers publishes a recommended list of the 40 topics that preachers should cover in the average year on a regular basis, and only 1 out of 40 of the suggestions mentions pain. And the main focus of the topic is just trusting God in pain. And then, take it out of the church, the things that we say to each other in the midst of pain expose our difficulty with suffering unless it comes neatly packaged with a positive message. Over the last few weeks, as I've been known we're coming to this sermon series, I've been going through and looking at the things that I know that friends on Facebook who are going through very difficult times. And I've been looking at the things that people are posting on their Facebook pages and timelines to encourage them. These are Christian friends. Some of my favorite memes that make their way onto their Facebook pages are this one. You're going through a lot because you're going places. God is trying to prepare you for what's to come. When you're going through something tough and wonder where God is, remember the teacher is always quiet during the test. God often uses our deepest pain as our launching pad for our greatest calling. You have to believe, no matter what has come against you, no matter how unfair it was, things are shifting in your favor. And one of my favorites, trust in God, believe God will make a way. Every wound heals, every memory fades, every struggle ends, every sunrise brings blessing, every rainbow brings hope, everyone has a choice, every prayer has an answer, amen. And these are people with cancer, grieving loved ones, broken marriages, rebellious children, lost jobs. These are people in grief and suffering and brokenness. The language of lament, the protest of suffering and difficulty is scarce in our Christian spaces. Yet, in the book of Psalms, which we know is the song book, the prayer book, the worship book used in ancient worship by our ancestors of faith, Israel, we find that the longest and largest category is Psalms of Lament. Roughly 60 out of 150 Psalms, that's 40% of the book of Psalms, are just Psalms of Lament, with the other 90 divided into more than 5 different categories. One scholar of the Psalms writes, much of our worship is designed to inspire and happens in the context of a positive atmosphere of song and celebration. Related to this is the idea frequently expressed in Christian circles, openly and subtly, that it is a sign of spiritual maturity to praise God in all things, and the implication that anything less than praise indicates spiritual problems or deficiency on a person's part. And this perspective is distorted and simply not the example given to us in the Psalms of Lament. The Psalms of Lament teach us that lament is just important in worship as praise. In fact, there are more of them than any other type. So in truth, our modern ideas of worship centering on positive emotions are narrowly conceived. Lament, with all the pain, grief, despair, and even anger expressed, is just as much an act of worship and an expression of faithfulness to God as more socially acceptable and popular positive expressions found in the majority of our worship. He concludes, the fact is a crucial theological truth that the church is in danger of being lost because it hasn't reclaimed lament. The simple fact that not all of life is positive, but all of life comes under God in these prayers. The Psalms. The Psalms were the songs and prayers used in the communal and personal worship of God's ancient people. And judging from the sheer number of them, compared to Psalms of confession and praise and petition and wisdom and others, the ancient people of God spent a significant amount of their communal and personal time being present to pain and protesting it. And then we look at Lamentations. One biblical studies scholar who specifically has studied Lamentations, John Brocky, believes the Psalms remind us of the importance of lament in well-rounded worship, but the book of Lamentations is what truly shows us the purpose of lament, naming the truth, protesting the way things are, and calling out to God because of that reality. He writes, Lamentations can be seen to deal with the way of hope and despair, suffering and faith are thoroughly intertwined without easy resolution. We should not come to this book expecting answers to questions about the meaning of suffering, because that isn't its purpose. Lamentations isn't there to provide us answers for the problem of pain. Instead, Lamentations offers us a model for how to speak about pain, truthfully about the condition of the world, and address God about suffering in the world. Such expression is not common in our culture or our churches. Our culture is optimistic and values certainty and confidence. To speak of suffering is a sign of weakness and pessimism. But the very practice of lament is to see suffering of others and our own and to speak of it before God and the world. Now, we aren't living in the rubbled shadows of a devastated city as the contemporary people of God. But it doesn't take much of a glance to know that our world hasn't miraculously become a utopia of shalom and justice and mercy. All the happy edification in the world can't cover up the reality of pain and suffering and difficulty, of oppression, injustice, hate, inequity, greed, corruption, unfaithfulness, war, disease in our neighborhoods, in our community, in our nation, in our world. Yet we spend very little time in our communal and personal worship telling the truth about this reality. And the world is noticing our silence on the pain of the world. You see, as our churches have gotten happier and more positive and more upbeat over the last few decades in hopes of combating their decline, church attendance and participation has declined, especially among younger generations. Perhaps we could chalk this up to coincidence. It's just a coincidence that things have gotten happier, but our churches and Christians identifying as such have gotten lower. And we could do that if we didn't have studies and surveys from Pew Research and the Barna Group and the Brookings Institute and Gallup, all identifying that in large part, the numbers of people who have either left the church because they were once a part of it, or who are choosing not to be a part of the church, to identify even as Christian, are expressing that they've done so because of a disconnect between what they see and experience in the church and what they see and experience in the world. Younger generations are identifying that the church is becoming increasingly irrelevant and disconnected to all the issues and the problems and the suffering that they see around them. And they identify that they want to be a part of a people who are willing to name it and live into it and do something about it. One recent church defector and self-described destructing Christian put it this way: "The Sunday after the Pulse nightclub shooting, we sang 'How Great Is Our God' and listened to a sermon on the importance of prayer. But nobody actually prayed for the people who experienced that tragedy. A few months ago, there was a sermon about creation, the right things to believe about how the world was created. We are experiencing an environmental crisis in creation right now, in the present. But as Christians, apparently the most important thing is that we all believe the right things about how the world was created so long ago. I've never once heard a sermon on the responsibility for caring for creation right now. I've heard sermons on how to be a good wife or a good husband. I've heard sermons calling out infidelity in marriage and remaining pure before marriage, but I've never heard a sermon that has anything to do with consent, assault, or domestic violence. And these are statistically huge problems in the world and the church. I'm not sure," she concludes, "if Christians just don't care about the things going on in the world, or if they're too scared about the things going on to bring them up. And either way, I just don't see the point of getting together with a group of people for a few hours a week to pretend that reality doesn't exist. Either way, I just don't see the point of getting together with a group of people for a few hours a week to pretend that reality doesn't exist." That might sound like a harsh critique, and it certainly doesn't fit all churches, but it's accurate enough to describe the results of the variety of surveys and studies and research over the last decades of church decline. It lets us know, it puts us on notice, really, that even if happy endification is tolerated and even sought after in some places, it won't be tolerated in the church. People are hungry and looking for a place that will lead in the naming of the pain and suffering of the world before God and in the active participation in its ending. And while lament might seem like the least likely avenue, the least likely place to find spiritual renewal in our churches and ourselves, it also might not be. The purpose of lament is to get present to suffering, others and our own, to tell the truth about that reality before God and the world, and to stop pretending that reality doesn't exist. So that's what we're doing for Lent. Sounds fun. We're going to learn to lament through the people's poetic protest in Lamentations. Besides these sermons, we're going to learn through our own praying and through song, singing songs, they're hard to find, of lament together. And then we're also going to just listen to some of the modern songs of lament that people are putting out there more and more from the church at the end of each sermon. So this morning, our lesson continues through these words sung to us through the song Forsaken.
Why have you forsaken us? Where have you gone? Why have you forsaken us? How can we go on? There's a woman who has lost her child, and a man who's lost his way. There's a boy who's keeping it inside, and a girl who cannot pray. Why have you forsaken us? Where have you gone? Why have you forsaken us? How can we go on? We search for your face, search for your grace. We want to follow your way. Why have you forsaken us? Where have you gone? There's a man who says he cannot breathe, and another with a gun. There's a family who's left everything, just exiles on the run. Why have you forsaken us? Where have you gone? Why have you forsaken us? How can we go on? We search for your face, search for your grace. We want to follow your way. Why have you forsaken us? Where have you gone? There's a man forsaken on a cross, body broken in two. There's a God hanging on a cross who feels it all too, crying with us, dying with us, praying with us, holding us too, crying with us, dying with us, praying with us, holding us too, crying with us, dying with us, praying with us, holding us too. We search for your face, search for your grace. We want to follow your way. We want to follow your way.
And together we pray this prayer, a prayer of lament.